AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers. And today I have a couple of very special guests. In fact, today is a reunion of sorts. 28 short years ago, my colleagues and I were members of the original founding executive committee of a brand new organization at CIA called the Clandestine Information Technology Office, CETO. Over the intervening years, that has become the Information Operations Center, and then more recently, the newest directorate at CIA called the Directorate of Digital Innovation. So this really is a reunion of sorts for the three of us. I'm pleased to welcome a good friend and old colleague as my co-host. Chris Parker spent a career at CIA, serving in a number of senior executive positions in both the Directorate of Operations and the Directorate of Science and Technology. He also served at NSA and DIA. Before joining CIA, he was a helicopter pilot with the U.S. Army. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Santa Clara University, and he's participated in a number of executive training programs at various institutions around the United States. And I'm very pleased to say Chris is the Vice Chairman of AFIO. Chris, welcome to AFIO Now.
Good morning, Jim, and thank you for that warm welcome. Today, it's my pleasure for our guest speaker, Dr. Joseph KEOGH. And to open it up a bit, I think I'd like to go through a brief review of his biography, because that will help set the tone for the book and the theme of creating mission impact. And you'll see how that wide experience came to play in the creation of this book. Joe is a distinguished military graduate, Army ROTC, I might add, from Drexel University. Also has an MBA from George Mason here in Fairfax, Virginia, and a PhD in organic chemistry from the University of Colorado in Boulder. That led to a 32-year career with CIA with a varied assignment throughout the Science Technology Directorate, the Directorate of Administration. The key interactions during that 32-year career was partnering with Tony Mendez, famous from the movie Argo and Hollywood. We'll hear a little bit about that Hollywood interaction coming up. Also a chief engineer of a development group in CIA, 5 years as an office director, and also as a senior technical advisor and chair of a training academy. Culminating all that is time with both the White House Executive Exchange Fellow Program and a Reserve Officer, Army Intelligence. Joe, Dr. Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Joe's fine.
Joe, I know you brought this book together with some co-authors. Would you do us a favor and also introduce us to your co-authors? And I believe, sadly, one of them has passed away.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Yes, I two co-authors, and one is Dr. Joe Ball, who is both an agency senior scientist, a cadre of only about 30 or 40 folks, and he also served as a chief of station. He spoke 4 languages, was an Army officer, and has a PhD in theoretical physics from Princeton University. But above and beyond that, he was someone who could abstract from examples into broad guidelines, broad principles. So you'll see some of that in the book. Joe did pass away early in the development of the book, but he was an active participant in the workshops we used to run. And we incorporated in the appendix of the book, and I'd ask everyone to take a look at that, some of his thoughts, notes, and experiences. And he was also someone who was very steeped in history, both military and intelligence history. And as a result of that, he was very good at looking forward and seeing what was to come. So some of that is also in his notes in the book. And then Dr. Greg Moore is our other author who lives out here in Colorado on a ranch. Greg is a PhD in materials science, who is known for two things, I think, primarily in general terms. One, he used to develop products for our operational. Greg was known for his ability to understand operational needs and deliver devices and products that were right on the money. For example, in one case, with one of our teams that was involved in some very high-risk activities, he worked with them to deeply understand their needs, and he went off and developed a product that he returned to them for testing, for field testing, preliminary field testing. And after a few months, he hadn't received back his device and asked me to check into it, which I did. And the operational leaders said, "This is too valuable in the field. We can't give it back to him. So tell him to build another one." But that was common with what he did. Also, what he was very effective at is in the case where agency interest was going to be low because it was emerging technology, for which there's a lot of discussion these days, he would see where the emerging technology was, understand the agency's need, and work with other organizations, DARPA, for example, to bring the technology along in the direction where it would be useful for the agency. And at the point where that became something we could see very clearly going forward, he would bring it in and we would develop it as a operational device capability. So it's very effective at both of those activities, both of those pieces of the mission. Also, he has written 4 books, including his latest one, which is on Southwestern cooking, but the others have to do with his experience in the agency. So he's been very prolific in that regard and a tremendous contributor to the book.
Excellent, Joe. As we start to delve into the book, and you've talked about your co-authors, what would you describe as the motivation for the book? Why?
Right. Well, it goes back to the era around 911, after 911, and after almost a decade of hardly hiring anybody, we suddenly had a tremendous influx of very impressive people. I used to review their resumes once they were on board, and they were just incredibly impressive already into their careers, late 20s, early 30s. But once they were here a few months, they started complaining that their ideas weren't being accepted, that they were being ignored. And we were asked, I was the chair of the technology side of the HUMINT Academy. They asked us, "Hey, could you take a look at this, see what's underneath it?" So we started interviewing a lot of these folks about how they were introducing their ideas, where they were, and with whom. And what we found out was, despite their impressive resumes, they really hadn't had much experience at bringing ideas forward in an organization that was hierarchical, was also involved in some very risky activities, and change was not something that was easily accepted. So we decided to build a workshop, a few days, which we called Operational Innovation, where we could discuss these issues and kind of put them on the right path for bringing their ideas forward. So that laid on their shelf. Then I went back on the line as a leader of an office. And in about 2020, as COVID came upon us, we decided, all 3 of us living along the Front Range of the Rockies, that maybe it would be a good idea to take what we learned there, plus our combined 80 years of experience in innovative activities, and put it into a book form. Now, what we hope to achieve with the book is to empower technical and non-technical officers in the agency and hopefully in the broader intelligence community. And we're very pleased that we have this opportunity with AFIO, who does serve the broader community. We want to empower them to bring forward their ideas in an efficient, effective way, because the environment today demands that. You can just look at what's happening in Ukraine, but broader than that even, that innovation is becoming a critical capability that organizations need to have. And unfortunately, many of our members in the community view innovation as just a technical thing. It's far from that. The greatest innovations, including some that are on the way, hopefully, to greatness, are in the book, and they don't have anything to do really with technology. So we're trying to get this broadened. The book itself is a guide. It doesn't cover, there's thousands of books written on innovation, can't cover everything, but it is a guide for agency officers new in their career or in their mid-career as they try to begin a journey, an innovation journey. And so that's the motivation.
Great. Now, you've raised a point here that I think it was important for me to understand as I read the book. And I'd like you to spend a little bit of time so that we understand the difference between innovation versus invention. And I think I've been guilty of thinking them as being the same thing.
Right. And many have, the words are used fairly loosely, but they have important distinctions, not just from a dictionary perspective, but also from a very, very practical perspective. So at the simplest level, invention has to do with bringing things into being, while innovation has to do with bringing them into use. Example that I think we're all familiar with, the product that comes from industry, is Post-it notes. Now, Post-it notes is a product that was built on a glue that didn't stick very well. It's one of my fellow Colorado chemists who came up with it. And he wasn't making much traction in a company where sticking was critically important. And he didn't have a use for it. So he was an inventor. But eventually, within the framework of 3M, there was another individual who had a need. And he had a Bible class, and every Sunday, I guess, the notes for that were falling out of his Bible. And he was looking for something that could stick in there, but not permanently. So he brought forward the idea that maybe this unstickable glue or poorly sticking glue could be used for that application. Well, it could be. And he marched it along, drove it by exposing and marketing the idea within 3M and then outside, and then developed the way to fabricate, manufacture it. It's now a $3 billion business with 3M, but the two roles were completely different. So the innovator and the inventor had different roles. They had different skill sets. That's important for our IC world, because we do have a lot of inventors, but then they don't know what to do with their inventions. That's where we have to have innovators come in. And the opposite is true as well. We have innovators with ideas, but not the ability to affect a initial product. And this leads us on to one directly related issue. Back in about 2003, we had what was called an innovation center in the agency. It was a very good idea to have such a thing. It was to be a catalyst for innovation. It was not to be the only place we did innovation, just a catalyst. And I went over there to the building in Tyson's Corner where that center was running. They had a wonderful environment. It was very open. There was whiteboards on wheels all over the place. And I noticed one of the questions they had on the whiteboard was, what's the definition of innovation? And there were literally tens of answers there. None of them seemed to come together. So we told the director, hey, we'll give that a shot. I was at the time leading an office that was involved with operational and analytic innovation. That was not an easy task. There isn't really a good definition, even using the internet. Maybe now with AI, we would find a good one. But we came up through discussions with a number of people, a definition that we think is most appropriate for the agency and other organizations within the community. The definition is innovation is bringing into use a change that has a positive mission impact. And we should be focused on the positive impact as opposed to the front end, which is the change, which can often be the part of the process for which there's a lot of excitement, there's money being spent, there's people doing things, and it generates a lot of excitement. But really the focus should be on the other end. What's the impact? And that's important because, as you'll see in the book, small changes can have a huge impact. And yet the folks that are bringing about the small change don't necessarily get as much attention as those with the front end buzz. So that's the definition of innovation we think is most useful for the community. Although, again, we'll see what response we get back as we have the AFIO, the larger AFIO group, engage with them.
Right. Now, we teased early on in your introduction about you having some kind of a previous relationship or experience with Hollywood. So maybe because we are talking about both innovation and invention, could you address those early days of your introduction to Hollywood and some things that came out of that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for bringing me back to those days. Yeah, I joined the agency in the mid-'70s. I owe my job to the Pike Commission, the Church Commission, where a lot of chemists were moved into other roles because of the nature of the work they were doing. And when I arrived, I was asked to help a fellow by the name of Tony Mendez, who had just recently returned from Asia. And he was the chief of disguise and was having some success at improving our disguise capability. At the time, disguise capability was something that most people said, real men. And at the time, fortunately, it's changed dramatically. But at the time, it was mostly men that were DO officers in the field. And they weren't, going to be using disguise, period. They didn't need it. And then secondly, the quality of the products we had just wasn't up to snuff. It was just beyond Halloween's best offerings. So Tony had formed a partnership with a fellow in Hollywood by the name of John Chambers, who won an Academy Award in 1969 for Planet of the Apes. And John was a real patriot, World War II history, and he was spending his time at the VA hospital in Chicago building devices for soldiers who had been disfigured by war. And he moved to Hollywood and became the number one makeup man in Hollywood. He was very inventive and innovative. He both created things and put them into use. But so my first assignment, Tony said, we're on the way. We need to go to Hollywood for a couple of weeks to get started on this. So we headed for Hollywood. I took a look in the mirror and I said, I don't know if this is going to work, but we went out there and we were working with John on a movie, 1977 version of Dr. Moreau. And Tony was introduced as John's artistic advisor. I was introduced as his technical advisor with no indication of where we came from. There was a crew of about 40 people getting ready to take all of their wares to the Caribbean for filming. So it was a great opportunity. I was there to learn all I could about the materials that were currently being used, what the problems were, what the deficiencies were. And of course, Hollywood had the benefit of the lens, so they could patch up a lot of that. But it was a very fruitful beginning to our engagement with John, which went on for many years. And he was very much involved with us in trying to develop the capability from afar. But there we were in the studio. To our right, they were filming a series called MASH. And to the left, they were filming a show called Charlie's Angels. And I would always go to lunch to the left. But it was an interesting time. And I did not get any leading roles. And I returned with Tony. And then we would go back there very frequently. And John would come out to the East Coast as we evolved. And he was he was a real patriot, but he said, you guys are CIA, you're supposed to be the best. I don't see the magic. This isn't really what I expected. And then finally, by about 1982, he said, okay, you guys are the best. And then we went on from there through the work of a lot of operations officers, artists, and material scientists. We had quite a team that was across the country.
As you get into innovation, Joe, I think we've also discussed the fact of the risk of the exquisite versus the good enough. And I think in your book, you also address it, referencing being minimally viable. Can you kind of bring those thoughts together as we look at innovation?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I'll hit the minimally viable first. There is a fellow by the name of Steve Blank who has written a number of books on what they call lean startup. It's a Silicon Valley take on how to innovate. And I think Steve has also spoken to many government agencies about our speed of innovation, which is nowhere near where he thinks it should be. But, in Silicon Valley, a lot of the folks put their houses up for second and third mortgages in order to fund their ideas. And his point is, whatever your idea, you really need to get to a minimally viable product so that you can take that and start having discussions with a number of people, a number of stakeholders related to that product. And that's how the product should, most effectively and efficiently evolve. So that concept does have relevance for the government environment. And so that prevents us necessarily from going to the exquisite as our main direction. It starts from a simpler place. There's a British philosopher who says that anything worth doing is worth doing badly. And what he really means by that is, in the history of innovation with ships and guns and all kinds of things, the first thing ever done is really pretty crude when you look back at it, but it was worth doing because it did then show value, which then began to migrate to something that was really quite valuable and useful. So that's one way to get out of the exquisite. The other thing about the exquisite is the communications between the user and the developer needs to be strong. We need to move away from what we call the throw it over the transom, where you may take down some requirements that have been given to you, but you really don't understand the problem. And then you develop something and then it's not useful. And maybe you go even further and make it exquisite, and then it's exquisite and not useful. So it's important to continue that dialogue. I'll give you one example, just one. We were involved in a very risky activity back in the mid-'80s involving a counterterrorism need. And it was a very difficult project to work because we didn't have much time. And there was potential for national embarrassment. And there was loss of life potential as well. So we marched quickly down the trail of developing something that would be useful. And we had a certain operational scenario we were working against. There was dialogue with the operators, but we were still heads down into developing this. Finally, we realized we just aren't going to get there. You cannot do this. And so we went to the operational leader who was looking for the product, and we said, we can't get there. And he said, well, what can you do? So we said, this is what this can do. Wasn't all the way there, but it was partway. He said, okay, I can alter the scenario to make this work, which is what we did. And so that need for communication is critical all the way along in the process. And too often we end up on that exquisite trail by having initial discussions and then by, moving forward. Tony, for example, where we had Sky's needs in Moscow, which were associated with certain scenarios to give our officers the ability to evade surveillance just long enough to be able to go meet with assets and do other things. He spent a lot of time in Moscow walking the streets, engaging with officers, really understanding the problem and the constraints. So, and from that came, useful products in terms of their realism and in terms of their ease of use. So, but you bring forward a critical problem. And I should say also that, the innovation process involves at the front end coming up with an idea or concept, and then selling that, if you will, to your leaders so that you get approval to move ahead, or you can get resources. And then It involves marketing that to the user group. And then if you get acceptance there, then you're often potentially running a fairly substantial effort. So along that line, the individuals that came up with the original concept may very well not be the ones to run the project. This is where leadership comes in. You've got to track along that process and make sure that the right people are engaged at various stages of the project. And it's a team effort. It's not 2 or 3 people in a lab or in an office developing the idea. It becomes a team effort. We have a case in the book, the virtual walk-in, which is a good example. That's a couple of people that worked for, unfortunately, longer than they should have to market the idea, to gain acceptance. And then once they did, suddenly we went from 2 or 3 people up to dozens of people working the project. Different skills were needed. Teamwork was needed. So
it sounds, Joe, like what you referred to is outside of the team that's doing the hard work, the lifting, if you would, the science, you need champions. And those champions are critical to get past or break that barrier of people can say no very easily. So you do want to address again, I think you've been talking about champions.
Right. Yeah, champions are very important, particularly I think in the IC community, because trust is an important element. And you need to be building trust when you're developing your idea and your minimally viable product, if you will, and beyond. But it's something that is really associated with the evolution of your role in the innovation process. And let me give you a few examples of where champions come in and why they're so important. When we were developing disguise capability back in the 70s, early 70s, mid 70s rather, again, very few people supported improving disguise. They thought it was at the limit and it wouldn't be used if it was even better. But there was an individual, he was a young officer at the time, but he had enormous credibility. He was a Harvard grad. He was a Marine Corps officer, combat experience in Vietnam. He had served overseas in tough spots. His name was Jack Downing. And 20 years later, he was the DDO, chief of the Directorate of Operations. But he believed firmly in disguise and in the need for it. And he also believed that it could be much better. So when we would go for resources, this was over in the legendary Office of Technical Services, sort of the agency's version of Q. When we would go and pitch for resources, we would always invite Jack. He had to come down the parkway, 12 miles and go back. Could cost him a couple hours, but he would show up and he would sit there, and the director of OTS would listen to our pitch for resources, and he would then look at Jack. Jack didn't say anything. He just shook his head. Yeah, we need this. And that's how we got resources. He was a champion. Jim will know, interestingly, 20 years later, when we were trying to bring cyber and HUMINT together in that office of CETO, we needed a champion. Fortunately, Jack at that time risen to the role of the director of the DO. And he was a visionary. He saw what was coming, and he supported us. And that made all the world of difference. So champions are very important, and they can be in unusual places. Like Jack was a junior officer, but had a lot of credibility, trust. And so in terms of the young innovators, and particularly in the agency in the 9/11 kind of time frame, we would, as part of the workshop, we made the point, you have to talk and vet your ideas with some of the old hands that could give you a fair hearing, and they might not like your idea, but they'll tell you why they don't like it and what the issues are. So build that trust, find those champions, makes life a lot easier.
Sure. Part of this too is you talk about taking risk, right? And That's difficult. There's a lot of failure along the way. And I think you have a good example in the booklet, how to deal with failure and the message that can send to the bigger workforce, depending on how you deal with that failure.
Right. It's a critical issue. And I will give you one example. I think this is what you're referring to. And Jim Hughes is critically involved in that. We had in this organization, CITO, the early days of cyber involvement with the Director of Operations. And we were very resource starved. And it was thought because of that we were also idea starved. There really wasn't much to be done. And so we were living within our means, which were modest. But Jim and his co-partner, co-executive leadership of the office, a fellow by the name of Jim Gosler, they came up with the idea of a innovation contest. They took some resources that we had, which were being applied to some operations which were not as effective as they had been in terms of the impact, and applied it to this innovation contest. Well, the result was a tremendous outflow of ideas, many of them from our operations officers and from our engineers, just an enormous number. Well, we sorted through that. And again, an innovation wasn't the leadership sorting through it, it was their peers and who were close to the action. And they picked out about 10 of these that they thought were worthy of moving forward because they had the likelihood of high impact or modest impact. And they seemed like the risk was manageable. So at any rate, 10 went forward, they were resourced, and several of them went on beyond that, but one was discontinued. They tried their best. They worked incredible effort, put incredible effort into it, but it just wouldn't work. So then awards were given out for the innovation ideas and where they were. And one of the awards, a winner, if you will, one of the winners was a fellow whose idea was spectacular. It would have had a major impact, but he just couldn't do it, couldn't get there. So he was given an award essentially for failure. And it sent a shockwave through the whole organization because they said, whoa, this leadership team will support failure. In fact, they'll even reward it. And that story went all over the office, and it had an enormous psychological impact. And so that was a case of, this was smart failure. I mean, he had the great idea and he had a plan to execute, but just couldn't get there. So failure is really a barrier to innovation, particularly if you're in an environment where failure can lead to dire consequences on how you're viewed. So,
right. In the roll up to getting something proposed to management, we've talked about different key roles, people, approaches, the need for champions, the tolerance for failure, etc. But I also think that you bring up in your book the need to undersell, and in the underselling, because oftentimes you may be talking to a non-technical person, something that they can relate to. Get it, right. An analogy that's familiar.
Right. In the discussions that we had back again, right after 9/11, with the new officers, asked them how they were presenting things and who they were presenting to and so forth, became clear that we did not have an effective approach. So I wrote an email to all of the operational directors in the DO, and I said, hey, can you help us out here? Our new folks are not having much success at bringing their ideas forward. So I got a tremendous outpouring of response. I mean, it was a real demonstration of leadership. They wanted to help. And so they put together their notes on what these folks should be doing and what they seemed to be doing. And it was guidance for a successful presentation of an idea to senior leaders who were incredibly busy. And so we put that in the book, many of those comments and suggestions and recommendations in the book. And yeah, one of the things they do stress is to undersell. They also stress, make it as simple as possible. We don't need to know about all the bells and whistles. We just need to know what the impact is going to be if it works. And then tell us about the risks. Don't sugarcoat this. What are the risks that we're assuming if we support this? Very practical, solid guidance. And we distribute it, and I think it helped. It helped a lot. So that was how they treat it. That's how we treated that, and it's in the book. And I think it's guidance that is valuable beyond the agency.
Right.
They're not looking, these senior leaders are not looking for someone coming in overly enthusiastic with a very rosy picture of what's going to happen. They want reality. So
right. Well, Joe, this has been a fascinating conversation to go through your book. Highly recommend it to people to get and take a look at. As you said, it's both not just for technical people, but non-technical people can benefit from it. Do you have any kind of closing or wrap-up remarks you'd like to make sure we're aware of?
Well, I think, Chris, you hit the button there. I do think we're going to be in for an innovation war on multiple fronts going forward. We need to be better at it. The agency tends to be really good at it when the gun is to our head, and then we respond. But some of the most important innovations are opportunity driven. They're things we can take advantage of, but we don't have to. There's no driver. One example in the book is the virtual walk-in. It took us 7 years to get that tried, and it became very successful. And in today's world, and you see it in the newspapers, we don't have any inside information, but the agency seems to be going all out, telling the world, particularly certain parts of the world, we're open for business. And not only that, they're telling them how to more securely contact us. So that's something that is, I think, very important and stressed in the book. Opportunity-driven innovation is a hard slog, but it probably will give you the better results or the more significant impacts. And so how to deal with that is touched on in the book. We may come back later with some more guidance on that. But thank you both. We really appreciate this opportunity, particularly the opportunity to go broader and to expose the book to the greater community. We hope it's valuable, and we look forward to any feedback we can get.
Jim, we'll throw it back to you to close us out. Thank you very much, Dr. KEOGH.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, this has been a fascinating, both interesting and educational conversation. The name of the book is Creating Mission Impact. I want to thank both Chris Parker and Dr. Joe for a very, very interesting session.
Thank you again, Jim and Chris.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.